We're pleased to be joined today by Kenny Jacoby, the USA Today investigative reporter who broke the story we will be discussing. Kenny covers issues of sexual assault and gendered violence in sports, schools, and law enforcement, and his stories have received national awards from groups such as Investigative Reporters and Editors, Education Writers Association, Associated Press Sports Editors, the National Headliner Awards, the Livingston Awards, and other journalism organizations. Kenny, welcome to Crisis Communications in Sports.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Now, we know you've been incredibly busy the past several weeks and continue to be. So, first, we just want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us. And for anyone who is not completely familiar with the Mel Tucker, Michigan State University saga that has been unfolding publicly over the last month or so, we encourage you to check out Kenny's reporting in USA Today because it's a fascinating story with so many twists and turns that we couldn't possibly cover in this session. But we do at least want to break down some of the communication tactics that have been utilized and speak a bit about how they could have possibly been handled a bit better by all the parties involved and how they might proceed going forward with their public strategies. So, by way of a very brief introduction or recap, I guess, of the story for anyone who's not totally familiar with it, Mel Tucker, the now former head football coach at Michigan State University, has been accused by Brenda Tracy, a prominent rape survivor and activist, of making sexual comments and masturbating without her consent during a phone call in April of 2022. The two are connected because Tracy had been hired by the university specifically to speak to the football team about sexual violence. For his part, Tucker claims that they had been in a romantic relationship at the time, and he considered it to be consensual phone sex. Now, we also can't tell the story without mentioning that at the time of Tucker's firing last month, he was nearly 2 years into an unprecedented 10-year, $95 million deal, which was fully guaranteed, meaning that the only way Michigan State could violate that contract or void that contract was if Tucker had engaged in some type of personal conduct that brought negative attention to the university. So that's the brief recap. Again, there's a whole lot more to it, but Kenny, the first thing we want to ask you is, you've known Brenda Tracy professionally for several years, so it's understandable that she would turn to you once she decided that putting out her side of the story in this situation was the best approach for her to take. But regardless, were you surprised at all that she was going that route, particularly given that it was just less than a month away from the Title IX hearing that was scheduled?
Yeah. So Brenda, yeah, as you mentioned, I've known her for several years now. We actually met when I was in college working at the student newspaper, covering a sexual assault case that happened there. And we've stayed in touch because I've continued to cover stories that intersect with the work that she does. I've interviewed her several times. She approached me in May 2023 and told me what was going on with her with this case at Michigan State. And that case had been going on since December. When she approached me at the time, it was not, to ask me to write a story about it, but she sort of talked to me off the record and, asked what, if anything, I knew about Mel Tucker. And about a month and a half later is when she actually decided to share the documents with me and have me write an article. The thought was that I would be writing this article as a sort of backup plan in the event that her name would get out. That we had already been hearing rumors going around. People had been asking the school about sexual harassment allegations against Mel Tucker, and this was sort of her plan in case the details were to spill out into public view sooner than she wanted to. Her plan was to wait until the hearing had ended, and that was our plan too, was to publish it after the case was resolved. Our timeline was moved up when essentially these rumors got to the point where Brenda's name was being included in them, and another outlet came out with a story that talked about part of the case, and so we decided to go ahead then and publish our full piece.
Yes, I know you discussed a little bit about you and Brenda's timeline and how she came towards you. But before we get way too deep in the discussion, I want you to help us and everyone out there that might be listening so they can get a better sense of the general timeline of when the events occurred and leading up to now. Because it definitely does get a little confusing at times, and it is really important, right, just to understand the full context. I think the probably the most unclear part of this is what Michigan State knew and when they actually knew it. So it sounded initially like the university sat on the information from Brenda's claims for anywhere from 2 to 8 months, and basically only acted after the story broke on September 10th by issuing the initial suspension and then basically starting the dismissal process. But please just tell me what the reality is and what you think the timeline was leading up to even now.
Yeah. So, I guess starting at the beginning, Brenda and Tucker's business relationship started in August 2021 when he hired her to come speak to his program about sexual violence. They stayed in touch over the next year. They were communicating regularly by phone and text. He invited her to campus 2 additional times to provide more programming to the team, and wants to make her an honorary captain at the spring game. So they had this ongoing relationship. The incident happened in April 2022, and a series of other events led Brenda to report it that December. So as far as the timeline of what the university knew when, they got Brenda's complaint in December. We've been told by Michigan State that once they got that complaint, they informed the president, the athletic director, and the board of trustees that there was a complaint against Mel Tucker. And they sort of mentioned that it came from somebody who was outside of the university, a vendor, but they didn't provide much more details than that. The one exception to that is the athletic director, Alan Haller, was given the name of the complainant, Brenda Tracy. Now, Michigan State has said since that they intentionally withheld details from their university leadership as a way to build a sort of firewall between them and the Title IX office, so that the Title IX office could conduct its own investigation and do so independently without any pressure or potential tampering from people at the highest levels of the school. That's what they've gone with. And so they've said that basically they didn't learn about the details of the case until they read our story on September 10th. And so they've been criticized for not they suspended him hours after we published our story, just a few hours. They've been criticized for not doing that sooner. The argument being, what did they know that was new then that they couldn't have known earlier? And I think that is a valid criticism. There are a couple things to consider. One, if the university suspends him at the onset before it's done a fact-finding investigation, that could, for one, open them up to liability. But number two, it would raise so many questions about why is Mel Tucker not here? Why is he being excluded from his own team? That it would really draw a lot of attention to the situation in a way that victims don't always want. Now, there's another argument that there's this sort of milestone reached in July when the fact-finding investigation was done. That could have been an opportunity for the school Title IX office to then share the facts with the university leadership and allow them to decide if they still wanted him to continue coaching or if maybe he should be suspended or even fired. But it doesn't sound like that information was shared around that time. It would have been shared presumably after the case was over, which could have still been a couple months. And so they've maintained that they didn't know about it until they read our story. And that by that time, it would have just been untenable for him to continue coaching these players and representing the school, given that all this was swirling around and up in the air.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this, Kenny, is because that's obviously the first thing that we focused on when we learned about the story with everyone else, is that I think even if you're the most ardent MSU fan and you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, it's just hard to believe that at some point in the months leading up, wherever you want to draw that line of delineation, when the investigation was closed or whatever the case may be, that that upper management, so to speak, the board, whatever, didn't know. And to your point, maybe the AD knew and somebody else didn't, and there was a breakdown in communication on their end, which is problematic in and of itself. But I think the takeaway here that the conclusion we drew is that when you're the university who so poorly mishandled the Larry Nassar situation, and it's still in the wake of that, right? We're only talking a couple of years. You don't get the benefit of the doubt that you're going to handle it as best as possible. So I think it's critical, even more so for them than maybe a different school, that they needed to at least not give the impression that they were sitting on this information, because what it seemed like was like at some point, whether it was July or sooner, that they probably knew and were kind of hoping that it would stay under wraps until the October hearing. Like we just to use a sports analogy, running out the clock. Let's see if we could just get to October. Yes, it would have been difficult to do ahead of time, but to do it on the day that your story comes out is just, people aren't going to delve into it the way we are, right? Like, as you know, I'm sure you want to believe that everyone's reading every word of your article, but there's a lot of headline readers. There's a lot of, sports ticker readers and social posts, and they're not getting this. All they're seeing is like, wow, MSU sat on this after everything that happened with, and then to have the interim president kind of say, well, this is not the MSU of old. Well, that's not what you're, what the optics say at all. Did you kind of get that impression as well when things were unfolding?
Yeah, I did. That line really stood out from interim President Woodruff's presser. Is this is not how the new MSU would handle a situation like that. We do fair and proper investigations, and we do it the right way. I do think, that was the first thing that people's mind went to, right? Is, did they cover this up? Were they trying to hide this from us? And that's a fair criticism just because of the university's track record, right? This is an institution where there's a tremendous amount of distrust. And so I don't think you can blame people for feeling that this had the stink of a cover up. I do think the university was in a pretty tough position because they do need to maintain confidentiality in these cases. Now, maybe they will go back and say, all right, if something like this were to happen in the future, we're going to share the information right after the fact-finding investigation is done, and we'll decide what to do then. We're not going to wait until the entire process plays out, especially because the hearing got delayed so many times. And it ended up taking just a lot longer than it probably needed to. But to their credit, I think that I have not seen anything to suggest that they've botched the investigation, or that they haven't followed their policies. And so maybe that in and of itself is an improvement from how they've done things in the past.
Yeah, I would definitely say so, especially if that's the case. I know Jim mentioned this earlier, but another factor of the story is that Mel Tucker signed a massive contract in November 2021. I think it was something about 10 years for about $95 million, and it was fully guaranteed, right? Which is almost unheard of and unprecedented at the time. So even if they were 0-12, right, or no matter what the performance was on the field, he was going to get that money. And basically, the only way they could find a way to, I guess, squirm their way out of such a contract is if they felt that he brought negative attention to the university. So in something like this instance, I think a lot of people roll their eyes at the timing of all this, considered that the record, they just seen a big setback from last year, and I don't think their expectations was met as they once did maybe a few years ago. And they still owed him $79 million with a bunch of years still left on the deal. How would you say that impacted the public perception of the story? Because I know, as I mentioned before, people are seeing this as a conspiracy just to get him out the door and not to pay him.
Yeah, and that's certainly what he has alleged, right? That this was just a sham designed to terminate his contract without paying him any of the money that was left on it. I don't think that that's necessarily a fair characterization here. But I do think, like, this is just an instinct that people have when they hear about just sexual harassment cases in general. They look for one thing, that they can sort of cling on to that says, like, well, actually, I'm not sure about this. And I wonder if this is, one of those 1% or 2% or 5% of cases that is actually a false report, that maybe the university is just acting in its own self-interest here. And you never really know in Title IX cases if that's the case or not, especially if it's a high stakes case, because of course they're thinking about the $80 million. That's pretty important to them, I have to think. And so, yeah, so I mean, especially with this school, right? I again go back to the mistrust. People just don't assume Michigan State is going to do the right thing. And so, that this money aspect becomes part of the conspiracy. And Tucker has certainly promoted that as, supporting, his claim that this is just a sham. And so people have sort of clung on to that, among other things, as sort of their indication that this is not really a fair process that's playing out. I don't know if that's necessarily fair, but I can't blame people for having that instinct.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because what you're referring to as far as I guess Michigan State's track record, we always call the credibility bank. How much goodwill have you earned over time? And obviously, theirs hasn't been great. And also in the case of Mel Tucker, wanted to get your thoughts on how much, because this is a classic sort of he said, she said, and absent of hard evidence. How much do you think Tucker's sort of misleading investigators during this whole process has hurt him and ultimately could end up being his undoing? Like, do you sense that just is really going to be like probably the biggest thing that sort of prevents him from prevailing on his side?
I do. I really do. I've seen enough of these sorts of cases that I know credibility is just a huge issue. And, it's one thing if you trip up over a small detail in your account, people make mistakes. The thing is, his contradictions have been multiple, and some of them have been about central aspects of the case. For instance, he initially told the investigator during his interview that he was at home in East Lansing when this phone call occurred. But in a letter that he wrote to the investigator the same day that he had turned in before his interview, he said he was at a hotel in Florida. And how do you square those two things? And I think, if really, you're being falsely accused and your whole career and reputation is coming down to this one interview you give, like that's something you got to get right, is where you were when this call occurred. And so I will be looking for that when this hearing report comes out that determines, whether he's found at fault or not. I think oftentimes these cases come down to credibility, and it might be difficult for the neutral hearing officer to look at this and say, yeah, I trust your side of this, Mel Tucker. There are at least 4 or 5 examples in which he's changed aspects of his story, or the records that the investigator obtained didn't bear out what he told her. And so I do think that's going to matter down the road. The only question is just how much weight they assign that.
Yeah, and we've seen Mel Tucker somehow try to counter some of these mishaps that he had during the investigation, when even last week on the 5th, while or shortly after the hearing began, he sent a letter to MSU basically saying that he uncovered substantial information that the school's internal investigation missed previously. And it included some text messages between Tracy and her now deceased assistant and friend, where Tucker claims to basically prove his innocence with those messages. Now we need to point out that the following day, on the 6th, Tracy was able to secure a temporary restraining order, barring Tucker and anyone associated with him from releasing any more of those private text messages. The odds, definitely seem to be against Mel Tucker in this situation, but it seems that putting it out there, once again, he was trying to get on the counterattack and try to alleviate some of the skepticism some of his detractors had, and basically contradict Tracy's account of all that and attack her credibility bank. I'm just wondering if you agree or not that this might have helped him, I guess, recover some of his public image, or do you think he might have dug himself a deeper hole, considering the fact that, he could seem like the villain in such a scenario?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a couple ways that you could look at it. One is from the Title IX case perspective, right? He could at some point, or he could have, if he had had this evidence earlier, introduced this as evidence in the case, right? And it could have been something that the investigator had considered as she was writing her report, or that the hearing officer considered as she was conducting this hearing. Instead of presenting it to the school and saying, here, we found this, add this to the case file, please incorporate this into your considerations. They just didn't show up to the hearing, and they released it out literally while Brenda Tracy was being questioned during the hearing, at a time when she was, not able to respond to it. And so he can still, when this case goes to appeal, ask for these messages to be admitted. It would come down to whether the investigator or hearing officer decides, number one, that they are relevant, and number two, that they weren't available at a time when he could have presented them. And I do wonder about both points. Number one, the relevant question, because some of this stuff that he has put in this letter publishing her messages is pretty loosely related to the case itself. It seeks to, I think, damage her character and credibility. But a lot of it is not exactly material to the, what is being alleged here. It may support a conspiracy theory, but I don't think it connects dots. And so I don't know that all of it would be admitted. The other thing is, they put together an 8-page, well-written letter with footnotes and 98 pages of heavily redacted attachments. How long did they have this? And were they unable to present it at a time when it would have made more sense to do so? So from the Title IX case perspective, I don't know how much these messages are going to come into play. But I think just from a saving face perspective, it did go a long way in, hurting Brenda in the court of public opinion. And even though they have this restraining order now, the cat is already sort of out of the bag. They've already said, what they've said, and they've painted her in the light that they did. And so that's the perception people are left with. So it was, I think, somewhat successful in that regard, from Tucker's camp.
Yeah, I definitely think he already assumes he's going to be playing the long game, even quite after this. I think many in the general population presume that at some point he is going to file a wrongful termination, I guess, lawsuit against MSU. If that happens, do you think, and they are able to get, well, if it happens and they are able to get their hands on Michigan State emails and other things that might be used as evidence to point that in the right direction, do you think it could lead to a settlement at some point where they at least pay him, if not the 79 million, something close to it? Because, as someone like me and Jim that basically advise on these communication strategies, we hope, right, they're prepared for this, and we know like the type of battle it's going to take in the court of public opinion. But even with that, and whether or not that happens, do you even think that is going to be, do you get a sense that it's going to be somewhat inevitable?
I do, from the legal experts I've talked to. They've told me that, look, the vast majority of these cases end in settlements. It's very rare for something to go to a jury trial. Perhaps MSU fights it, and sees if they can get it dismissed. And if not, maybe then, they look more seriously at settling. I think, the other, if this does go past the first motion for summary judgment that the university might ask to get the case dismissed over, then discovery opens up, right? And then you have Tucker is accessing everyone's emails at MSU and everything that they've ever said about this. And, that it just could get to a very ugly point, to where not only is MSU, fighting, paying tons and tons of money in legal bills, but they're also, their own reputations are being damaged in the process. And so I could see that being painful enough where they would just say, all right, let's just settle this and walk away. That would also come with, I think, a sort of hit in the court of public opinion as well, for the people on the other side of this who feel like Tucker shouldn't be paid a dime. So they are really between a rock and a hard place. And I don't know how it'll play out, but I think a settlement is definitely in the cards.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. Like you said, it seems to be sort of a map that these things follow, and that's probably where it's heading. And it remains to be seen what people will think. Because to your point, sometimes it could be the amount or just the idea that there is a settlement in the first place. And now, what's interesting, and we'll ask you to look into your crystal ball here a little bit if you can. To look down the road. I thought it was interesting that there was a couple of cases that popped up recently in the sports world that had sort of a common thread with this story. And I'm thinking about the Trevor Bauer situation and in Major League Baseball, and even the Pat Fitzgerald situation at Northwestern. One thing that was interesting was that Bauer retained the right to speak about it, which you don't always find to be the case after a settlement, and certainly did what he could to try and continue to clear his name. But so we don't know, of course, if that would ever be the case with Tucker. But what I am interested in getting your thoughts on is, do you sense that as more and more cases like this pop up, where let's say the person who at the brunt of it is unable to let things play out until they have their proverbial day in court, do you think there could be a reversal of trends where maybe we get to a point where people start arguing for that more, just in the court of public opinion, as you mentioned, where people kind of say, listen, we don't want to, the university in this case, or the whatever the organization, shouldn't be playing judge and jury. Suspend the guy without pay or something, or with pay, but let's get it to fruition before we judge to any jump to any rash conclusions. Do you think that could be headed that way, or is it just different with every case?
It's a good question. I guess I certainly have seen that sentiment that let's just let the court process play out and let the courts figure this out. There are reasons why people go into court, and there are very good reasons to not go into court as well. I would point out that there's another process that's playing out, which is the school's campus disciplinary process. That whole process is designed to be sort of like a mini trial, right? It doesn't have nearly all the same due process protections as a civil lawsuit, but there are very good reasons why we have these processes. And when these situations come up, schools need to address it. Unless you think schools just shouldn't be in the business of addressing these sorts of situations at all, which is contrary to what federal law requires them to do, then I think we have to respect these processes. And Tucker had the opportunity to show up to this hearing, to argue his case, to cross-examine his accuser, all these things that were introduced as part of federal regulations in 2020 designed to make the process more fair for the accused. He forewent all those opportunities. And so, he can say, oh, I've never had the opportunity to defend myself, I can't present evidence. He certainly had an opportunity. He passed up on that opportunity. And we don't know if he's going to sue the school, sue Brenda Tracy. We don't know if Brenda Tracy is going to sue the school or sue Mel Tucker. And so this Title IX case might be the closest thing we ever get to an investigation of just the facts of what happened here. A lawsuit around a termination, that's going to be about something different, right? Because the school terminated him for what he admitted doing, not what he's accused of doing. They said, you said you had a relationship with a vendor. That's inappropriate. That's fireable. And so there's these two different tracks going on. I think we have to respect the processes that are in place. I think they're fine processes. They're imperfect, but they're better than no process. And we also need to give some space for complainants in these situations to speak out without everybody jumping on them and rushing to judgment and sort of retreating to their camps before the actual process has run its course.
Yeah, yeah, I know it's easier said than done, but very valid points. And we know that this story is likely to keep you busy for weeks, months, and possibly years to come. So we thank you so much for your time, Kenny. Again, for anyone who's just getting familiar with the story, please check out all of Kenny's work on usatoday.com. And I believe it's at Kenny for Twitter, X, correct? Is that
Jacoby. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Kenny Jacoby. Yeah.
Yeah.
So please check it out. And again, thank you so much, Kenny. We really appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks.